This is a work of fiction, inspired by historical accounts, and does not promote or glorify illegal activities. There's something about the slow deterioration of bodies that has always fascinated me. Perhaps that's why I chose to work in the restoration of ancient works of art, especially those made with organic materials. I like to think of myself as bringing life back to what was destined to disappear. My colleagues call it a calling. I prefer to think of it as just a well-channeled obsession. My name is Sofia Luna. I am 32 years old, and until 3 months ago, my life was a predictable sequence of events. Waking up at 6 in the morning in my small apartment in the historic center, drinking black coffee while reviewing academic articles, walking 20 minutes to the National Museum of Anthropology, where I worked underground in a restoration laboratory away from the public eye, and returning home after 8 at night, exhausted but satisfied with the meticulous work done. It was precisely this routine that put me on the path to the Valdez collection. Manuel Valdez was a controversial anthropologist of the 1970s, known for both his significant discoveries and his questionable methods. During expeditions in the Andean region, he amassed a considerable collection of ritual artifacts from pre-Columbian indigenous communities. The collection remained in the private possession of the family for 50 years until his granddaughter, Elena Valdez, decided to donate it to the museum after her grandfather's death. When the boxes arrived at the lab, accompanied by incomplete documentation and stained field notes, my director assigned the project to me. "Sofia, you have a great touch for delicate things," he said, setting 3 weathered wooden boxes on my desk. "The family insisted that the entire collection be kept together. There are some ceramics, textiles, and other things that will need your special attention." The way he hesitated at the last part should have been my first warning. I began the cataloguing work the next morning. The first 2 boxes contained what I expected: polychrome ceramics with zoomorphic motifs, textile fragments with intricate geometric patterns, and a few polished stone tools. Everything was dirty and in need of restoration, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was the 3rd box that changed everything. It was heavier than the others and sealed with a dark red, almost brown, wax seal with a strange symbol that didn't belong to any pre-Columbian culture I knew of. It looked like a spiral within a circle, with small, radiating lines that resembled a stylized human figure, but upside down. I broke the seal carefully, saving the fragments for later analysis. The smell was the first thing I noticed when the lid opened, a sweet and putrid odor at the same time, like fermented fruit mixed with damp earth. Inside, wrapped in unbleached cotton cloth, was an object that defied my immediate comprehension. It looked like a small ritual table, about 18 inches high, supported by 3 carved legs that resembled stylized human bones. The top, however, was what really caught my attention. It was made of a yellowish material that I initially thought was very old wood, but when I touched it with latex gloves, I recognized it instantly. Human bone. The top had been constructed from what appeared to be parts of flattened skulls, held together with some kind of resin. The surface was densely carved, with pictograms depicting human figures in various contorted positions, their mouths open in silent screams. In the center of the tabletop was a circular depression, stained with a dark, dried material that I suspected was old blood. Around this depression, inscriptions in a language I did not recognize formed concentric circles. As an experienced restorer, I had dealt with ritual objects that incorporated human remains. This was not uncommon in certain ancient cultures. What disturbed me, however, was the strange sensation when touching the object, as if it was vibrating subtly beneath my fingers, emitting a heat that should not be present in something so ancient and inanimate. From the bottom of the box, I pulled out a small leather notebook, Valdez's field journal. The yellowed pages contained frantic notes about a cult called Los Devoradores de Huesos, the Bone Eaters, which he said practiced rituals of communion with ancestors by literally embedding their remains in everyday objects. The table, he explained, served as a communicative portal between the living and the dead, a place where the living offered their blood and the dead responded through dreams and visions. On the last page, a shaky note read simply, "They are hungry, always hungry. What started as research has now become something else. Elena, if you ever read this, burn the table. Don't give it away. Don't study it. Destroy it." Clearly, her granddaughter had not read the diary before the donation. That first night after opening the box, I dreamed of endless corridors in an unknown museum, where every display case contained the same life-size ritual table. On each display case, a body was laid out like an offering. At the end of the corridor, an empty table waited. As I approached, I saw my name engraved on the side. I woke up drenched in sweat, my body so hot that for a moment I thought I had a fever. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel right now and leave a comment about any strange experiences you've had with ancient objects. True stories can be scarier than fiction, and I'd love to hear about your own experiences with the unexplained. The next day, I returned to the lab, determined to treat the object with the scientific professionalism that my position demanded. I photographed the ritual table from every possible angle, measuring every detail and recording the inscriptions for later linguistic analysis. I tried to ignore the way my fingers tingled as I touched the object, even through my gloves, or how the fluorescent light in the lab seemed to cast unsettling shadows across the carvings when I wasn't looking directly at them. I needed to clean the organic material from the central cavity for proper analysis. Using a cotton swab dipped in the appropriate solution, I began working on the dark stain. That's when I noticed something strange. The liquid wasn't dissolving the stain, as it should. Instead, the substance seemed to absorb the liquid and expand slightly. I blinked several times, thinking it was a trick of the light. Working late again, Sofia. The voice of Diego, the night security guard, almost made me drop my instruments. I hadn't realized it was already past 9 at night. I lost track of time, I replied, trying to control my rapid breathing. It's a fascinating object. Diego looked at the ritual table with obvious discomfort. It looks, macabre, like those ancient things that should stay buried. His reaction inexplicably irritated me. It's an important historical artifact, not a horror movie prop, I retorted with an uncharacteristic sharpness. He held up his hands in surrender. I just came to let you know that I'm locking up the main building. You have the key to the side. Exit, right? I nodded, already turning my attention to the object. I barely noticed when he left, muttering something about, "Be careful with those old things." I continued working for a few more hours, completely absorbed. At one point I accidentally tore my glove off on a sharp edge of the table, and before I could stop myself, a small drop of blood from my finger fell directly into the central hollow. It was as if the entire lab held its breath. The silence became absolute. Not even the constant hum of the ventilation system was audible. I watched, paralyzed, as my blood seemed to be absorbed by the porous material, disappearing completely within seconds. The inscriptions around the concavity, previously just colorless carvings, began to emit a faint, reddish glow. It was so subtle that I thought it was just the reflection of my inspection flashlight, but when I turned it off, the glow persisted for a few seconds before dissipating. I needed air. I carefully put the object away, locked the lab, and walked out into the cold city streets, feeling an uneasiness I couldn't quite name. On the way home, I had the constant feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned around, I saw only normal shadows cast by the streetlights, but something about them seemed off, as if they were slightly out of alignment with the objects casting them. That night the dream came back more vivid. The tables now had bodies in various stages of decomposition on them. Some were still fresh, others were already reduced to bones. Most disturbingly, though, all of the bodies had my face on them. At the end of the hallway, the empty table was now stained with a drop of fresh blood, my blood, and seemed to be pulsing like a heart. A figure stood beside her, its back to me. It was tall and thin, with limbs far too long for a normal human. When it began to slowly turn around, I woke up screaming. My apartment was freezing cold, despite the typical warmth of that time of year. In the corners of the ceiling, I noticed patches of moisture that formed patterns curiously similar to the inscriptions on the ritual table. I took out my phone to photograph them, but when I looked again, they were just normal patches of moisture. The next day, I arrived at the lab early. Something had changed on the object. The inscriptions seemed deeper, sharper, as if they had been recently re-engraved. The central hollow, which had been stained dark, was now a bright red, shiny, almost wet. I needed a second opinion. I called Martine, a colleague who specialized in ritual artifacts from the Andean region. When he arrived, I explained the Valdez collection, first showing him the more conventional pieces from the other boxes. "And this is the most intriguing object," he said, uncovering the ritual table. Martine adjusted his glasses, leaning forward, to examine the piece. For a moment he remained silent, his face furrowed in concentration. Then, abruptly, he stepped back. "Where did you say this came from?" "From the Valdez collection. Manuel Valdez obtained it during—" "No," he interrupted. "I want to know exactly where it was found, in what archaeological context." I handed him the diary. Martine flipped through the pages quickly, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finished, he closed the notebook with extreme care, as if it were something that might explode. "Sofia, this shouldn't be here," he said finally. "The bone-eaters are not just an anthropological curiosity. There are consistent reports of this cult in different historical periods, always associated with disappearances and transformations." Transformations. People who gradually change after prolonged contact with cult objects. They begin to isolate themselves, develop sensitivity to light, lose their appetite for normal food. He hesitated. "There are reports that they develop an alternative appetite." A chill ran down my spine. "You're not serious." "I'm simply reporting what the historical record indicates," he replied defensively. "Look, how long have you been working on this?" 3 days. "Have you noticed anything strange, unusual dreams, different physical sensations?" I hesitated. The rational part of my brain resisted the idea of sharing my dreams and feelings. It would sound like superstition, not science. But something in Martine's worried look made me answer honestly. Yes. Vivid dreams about the object. And yesterday, I accidentally cut my finger. A drop of blood fell into the central concavity. Martine paled visibly. "Sofia, we need to seal this immediately. I'll talk to the director about having it stored under special conditions until we decide how to proceed." "You're overreacting," I protested, a wave of irritation washing over me. "It's just a historical ritual object." "No, it's not," he said, picking up the diary again and opening it to a specific page. "Read this." The passage described how Valdez had witnessed a ritual in which participants drank a mixture of blood and bone ash from their ancestors, entering a deep trance, during which they claimed to be able to communicate with the dead. But there was a price. Each communication required a sacrifice. The dead, Valdez wrote, were never satisfied with just a few drops. They eventually demanded more, much more. Valdez's last expedition lost 3 members, Martine continued. Officially, they were accidents in the mountains. But there are rumors. What did he sacrifice them for? I asked incredulously. Or that the table took them? I laughed nervously. The table took people? Now you really sound like a cheap horror story. Martin didn't smile. How long have you been working in historical restoration, Sofia? 7 years? In all that time, have you ever come across something you couldn't fully explain? Something that seemed to have a presence of its own? I thought of a few objects over the years that had caused me inexplicable discomfort. A funeral mask that seemed to subtly change expression depending on the angle of the light. An antique mirror where the reflection seemed to be delayed by half a second. Small anomalies that I had always rationalized away. "I'll talk to the director," Martin insisted. "In the meantime, don't work alone with that object, and please don't let any more bodily fluids come into contact with it." After he left, I looked back at the ritual table. In the cold light of the laboratory, it looked like just that, an ancient, fascinating but inanimate object. I touched its surface lightly with my glove, expecting to feel that strange vibration again, but now it was cold and still. "You're making me paranoid," I muttered to the object, immediately feeling foolish. That night, I was reluctant to go home. I didn't want to face another dream of endless hallways and ritual tables. I stayed at the museum until late, reorganizing catalogues and finishing overdue reports. When I finally left, it was already past midnight. The streets were deserted, creating an unsettling atmosphere, heightened by the deep shadows of the historic buildings. Every few steps, I glanced back, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I was absolutely certain I saw a tall, thin figure turning a corner, but when I got there, the street was empty. My apartment looked different when I walked in. Nothing was visibly out of place, but the sense of familiarity was gone. It was like walking into a stranger's house who happened to have identical furniture to mine. The air was thick and still, with that same putrid sweet odor I'd smelled when I'd opened the ritual table box. I checked the refrigerator and the trash, thinking it might be spoiled food, but found nothing. I tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. When I finally did, the dream returned, but in a different form. Now I was no longer walking down the hallway. I was lying on one of the tables, unable to move. Around me, tall, thin figures gathered, their forms obscured by a dark mist. I could see only their hands, long, thin fingers, more like dry twigs than human limbs. They touched my body reverently, like connoisseurs inspecting a work of art. One of the figures leaned over me. Though I couldn't make out his features in the darkness, I felt his cool breath against my face. He spoke in a language I didn't know, but somehow I understood perfectly. "The table has chosen you. Hunger will be satisfied through your hands." I woke up drenched in sweat, my body shaking uncontrollably. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, and for a moment I felt relief that I had survived the night. Then I noticed my hands were stained with dark, damp dirt, as if I had dug into the ground with my bare fingers. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Share your theories about what's going on with Sofia and the mysterious ritual table in the comments. Your thoughts may reveal aspects of this story that even I didn't realize when I wrote it. Each subscription feeds our portal for even more disturbing stories. I took a long shower, scrubbing my hands until they were red, but the dirty feeling lingered. On the way to the museum, I stopped at a small church I had never been in before. I'm not religious, but at that moment, the need for a sacred space, some protection from whatever was happening, seemed vital. The church was nearly empty, except for an elderly woman praying in one of the front pews. I sat in the last pew and closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts. When I opened them again, I noticed something disturbing. All the statues of saints around me seemed to be watching me, their heads subtly turned in my direction. I left in a hurry, convincing myself that it was just my overactive imagination, the result of sleepless nights and the suggestion of Martin's words. At the lab, I discovered that the director was at a conference and wouldn't be back for 2 days. Martine had left a message saying that he was researching the bone-eater cult further and would be in touch soon. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to face either of them right away. I didn't know how to explain my current state without sounding completely unstable. The ritual table lay where I had left it, covered with a protective cloth. Part of me wanted to keep it that way, to never look at it again. But another part, a part that seemed to grow with each passing hour, yearned to uncover it, to touch its surface again, to feel that strange vibration beneath my fingers. I gave into that urge. When I removed the cloth, I nearly screamed. The central hollow, which had previously contained only that reddish stain, was now filled with a dark liquid that bubbled slowly, like blood simmering over a low heat. The surrounding inscriptions emitted that same faint glow I had noticed before, forming hypnotic patterns that seemed to move when observed out of the corner of my eye. My rational reaction should have been to call someone, to document the phenomenon, to seek scientific explanations. Instead, I removed my gloves. A voice in my head, one that didn't seem entirely my own, was whispering that I needed to touch the liquid, that I needed to complete something I had accidentally started. My finger hovered over the indentation. The liquid stirred, as if responding to my proximity. At the last moment, a flash of awareness made me flinch. I put my gloves back on, covered the object, and left the lab, locking it carefully. I spent the rest of the day in the museum library, obsessively searching for any references to the bone-eaters cult. I found few direct mentions, but many parallel stories of Andean cults who practiced rituals of communion with ancestors through objects made of human bones. In all the accounts, there was a pattern, the beginnings of a connection, vivid dreams, a growing hunger that could not be satisfied with normal food, and finally, a transformation. The exact nature of this transformation varied from account to account. In some, participants simply disappeared, presumably whisked away to some other plane of existence. In others, they became vehicles for ancient entities, their bodies mere vessels for ancient hungry consciousnesses. Towards evening, I received a message from Martine. I have found critical information. Do not touch the object again. I will be there tomorrow morning with a specialist. If you can, do not go home alone tonight. But I was already alone in the museum. Diego, the security guard, was on his rounds in another building in the complex. I considered calling a friend, but who would accept a request to sleep at their house without a plausible explanation? And what explanation could I offer that wouldn't make me seem insane? I decided to stay at the museum until the next morning. The staff lounge had an uncomfortable couch, but it was still better than facing another dream about those tall, thin figures. Before I settled in, however, I felt an irresistible compulsion to check out the ritual table one more time. The lab was darker than usual. Several bulbs had burned out simultaneously, a statistically unlikely event. When I turned on my flashlight, its beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, illuminating only a small circle in front of me. I slowly walked over to the table where I had left the artifact. The protective cloth lay on the floor. The ritual table, uncovered, seemed larger. Somehow its proportions slightly altered. The central hollow now overflowed with that dark liquid, which ran down the carved sides, filling each pictogram with its viscous substance. Most disturbing, however, were the marks on the floor around the table, damp footprints that did not correspond to any normal human footwear. They were long and narrow, with toes that were too thin, and they spread out in every direction as if several creatures had danced around the object, and the footprints were fresh. They were still wet. The air vibrated with a low sound, barely, above the threshold of human hearing, more of a sensation than a noise. My entire body resonated with it, my bones seeming to respond to some ancient call. That was when I heard footsteps in the hallway, the slow, uneven shuffling of something that didn't quite walk like a human being. The lab door, which I was sure I had locked, began to slowly open. I hid behind a cabinet, covering my mouth to silence my erratic breathing. Through the crack between the cabinet and the wall, I saw something enter the lab. The dim lighting made it hard to make out any details, but its silhouette was unmistakable, too tall, too thin, its limbs moving at impossible angles. The creature approached the ritual table and leaned over it, dipping what appeared to be long, bony fingers into the liquid in the hollow. A guttural sound of satisfaction filled the room, reverberating off the walls of the laboratory. Then, in one fluid movement, the creature turned its head toward me. I could not see its face in the dim light, but I felt its gaze fixed on me. "We have waited for you, Sofia," it said in a voice that sounded like several voices overlapping, speaking the same unknown language that I inexplicably understood. "The table has chosen. The hunger awaits." My body shook violently, primal fear taking hold of every cell. The creature took a step toward me, its movements fluid like water running down a slope. At that moment, the lights in the hallway came on, and I heard Diego's voice. "Sofia, are you still here? I saw the light in your lab." The creature froze, then retreated into the deeper shadows of the lab. When Diego opened the door fully, flooding the room with light from the hallway, there was no one there but me, shivering behind the cabinet. "Sofia, what are you doing there?" he asked, confused. "Is everything okay?" I emerged from my hiding place, unable to articulate a coherent response. Diego looked around the laboratory, his gaze settling on the ritual table and the damp footprints. "On the floor, what is this?" he asked, pointing to the liquid that now formed a considerable puddle around the object. "Don't touch," I finally managed to say. "Please don't touch." Diego, fortunately, was a man with a healthy respect for the inexplicable. He asked no more questions, only offered to walk me home or call me a taxi. I declined both, explaining that Martin would be coming in the morning and that I would prefer to wait in the break room. He nodded, saying he would stay close and check in with me every hour. I couldn't sleep, of course. I spent the night on high alert, startled by every noise in the old building. Sometime before dawn, I fell into a state of semi-consciousness. It wasn't quite sleep, but a trance in which images and sensations mingled. I saw the ritual table growing, transforming into an altar-sized structure. I saw tall, thin figures bringing people, some struggling, some walking willingly, to be placed upon it. I saw the dark liquid pouring into their mouths, their bodies writhing as something happened inside them, their bones visible beneath their skin, rearranging themselves into new configurations. And I saw myself standing beside the altar, no longer a victim, but a ritual officiant, my body already partially transformed, my fingers too long, my joints bending at impossible angles. I woke up to Martin's touch on my shoulder. I was accompanied by an elderly woman of indigenous origin who was watching me with piercing eyes. "Sofia, this is Carmen Wera. She knows the Bone-Eater cult better than any academic." Carmen inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "The object has already chosen you," she said without preamble. "I can see the mark on your aura, but it is not complete yet." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "From the sleepless night. The table is a portal," Carmen explained. "Not just a ritual object, but an entity in its own right. It was created to allow hungry ancestors to return through chosen hosts. The older the object, the hungrier those waiting on the other side. And this particular table, it's at least 7 centuries old. Those who created it were already old when the Spanish conquistadors arrived. They understand hunger in a way that the living cannot conceive, a hunger that transcends the physical, that seeks to devour not just bodies, but identities, histories, futures." Martin intervened. "Sofia, Carmen believes we can stop the process, but we need to act now before the connection between you and the object grows even stronger. We walked to the lab. When I opened the door, we all stopped abruptly. The sweet, putrid smell was now so strong that it made me instantly nauseous. The footprints on the floor had multiplied, crisscrossing each other in complex patterns that formed symbols similar to those on the ritual table. And the object itself, it had grown. It was no longer a small ritual table, but an altar-sized structure, just as in my vision. The bone top now clearly showed parts of multiple human skulls joined together, their empty eye sockets seemingly watching us. The central hollow was now a deep basin, filled to the brim.